The past is another country's castle. Ancient stones stand guard, layers of conquest buried, ice cream tastes of war. Ryukyu Rhapsody, roaring relics and riotous rituals. They say you haven't really seen Japan until you've seen a sunrise there, which seems a bit demanding. Nevertheless, we did our duty. We dragged ourselves out of bed to witness the sun christen another day in its own country. It was spectacular, a violent smear of orange and pink that confirmed the Earth was, in fact, still spinning. The camera, of course, captured none of it, producing only a photo that looked like a bruised peach. With the spectacle of basic astronomy out of the way, we headed for some organized culture at a place called Ryukyu Mura. It's an open-air museum, which is a nice way of saying they rounded up a lot of old Okinawan houses and plopped them down in a field to create a historical village. Several of these homes are genuine antiques, some over a century old, relocated from across the islands to be appreciated by tourists who otherwise might have to travel more than 20 feet from the parking lot. You can admire their traditional layouts, complete with special screen walls at the entrance designed to block evil spirits, a feature I'm sure is coveted by anyone with nosy neighbors. Perched on every rust-colored roof are Shisa, the local guardian dogs. They look like a cross between a lion, a gargoyle, and a very disappointed pug. They work in pairs. One has its mouth open, bellowing at bad vibes, while its partner keeps its mouth shut tight. The official story is that this keeps good fortune from escaping. My theory is that after 1,000 freaking years of marriage, one of them has simply learned to keep its opinions to itself. After contemplating centuries of spiritual warfare and marital compromise, we were thirsty. We stopped for a cup of freshly pressed sugarcane juice, which was demonstrated by a large, unimpressed water buffalo, however, harnessed to a stone mill. The animal trudged in a circle with the grim resignation of someone who knows their job has been obsolete for 100 years, but still has bills to pay. Recharged with pure liquid sugar, we wandered toward a crowd gathering for a folk dance. This was the main event. It starred a massive Okinawan lion, a creature of brilliant fabric, wild hair, and barely contained chaos, operated by two people who drew the short straws that morning. This magnificent beast of fabric and fury bounded into the audience and, as a sort of cultural handshake, proceeded to eat the head of a small child. The child, not having read the travel brochure, failed to appreciate this honor and erupted into screaming of world-ending proportions. The lion, a true professional, seemed unfazed by the shrieking. It simply retracted its jaws from the damp, screaming head and moved on down the row of tourists, hunting for a more cooperative snack. Its jaws snapped shut with a wooden clack like a firecracker. A sound that sent one woman, who had been innocently ambling toward the front, 2 feet into the air. Good fun for everyone but the child and the airborne lady. With the small human appetizer course concluded, we explored the rest of the park. We found a gigantic rope that held a Guinness World Record, though for what earthly purpose it was created remained a civic mystery. We also found a pavilion that seemed to be the source of every butterfly in Okinawa. The air was thick with them, a silent, fluttering storm of color. The butterfly counts not months but moments, and has time enough. Rabindranath Tagore. Fixed ferocity, the guardian grin of Okinawa. After the theatrical lion had its fill of misbehaving children and retired for the day, you start to notice its relatives. You see them everywhere. You see them on the tiled rooftops, crouched and ready. You see them flanking the gates, grimacing at the mailman. You see them in gift shops, miniaturized and grinning, ready to defend a cubicle from incompetent middle management. They are the Shisas, the official guardians of Okinawa, and they look like a cross between a lion and a particularly determined pug. My opinion of them changes with the light. In the morning sun, they're charming good-luck tchotchkes. By dusk, they look mildly unsettling, like a garden gnome that's seen too much. They almost always come in pairs with a sensible division of labor. One has its mouth open, presumably to bellow threats at passing demons. Its partner keeps its mouth shut, the better to hold on to good fortune. One partner handles shouting at the void, the other makes sure not to lose the good luck. It's the world's oldest domestic arrangement, but for the supernatural. This whole guardian pug industry, it turns out, was an import from China sometime around the 14th century. Back then, they weren't for quaint little houses, but for the big leagues, castles, temples, and royal tombs. They were a status symbol, the ultimate security system before cameras and alarmingly loud beagles. One of the most famous, the Tomimori stone lion, has been standing guard since 1689. It even has bullet holes from the Battle of Okinawa, making it not just a protector against spirits but a literal veteran. Some scholars say the open and closed mouths represent A and Un, the beginning and end of all things in Sanskrit. It seems like a heavy philosophical burden for a small stone creature that looks like it's trying to pass a kidney stone. Still, it's hard to square the image of a battle-scarred stone sentinel with the cheerful little guy you can paint yourself in a workshop here at Ryukyu Mura. And it's even harder to connect them to their other local relative, the Shishimai, the rambunctious lion costume performer from the village square. It seems Okinawan lions come in two distinct models, the silent, stoic type that guards your roof from ancient evils, and the loud, clacking type that startles tourists and eats children for applause. One is a silent guardian, the other needs an agent. Fading formula, the slow slide of a sacred secret. Everywhere you look in Okinawa, a pair of Shisa guardians stares back. One with its mouth open to scare off evil, the other with its mouth shut to keep good fortune in. It's a solid system for spiritual security. It is less effective, however, at protecting a traveler from a questionable lunch menu. At least that's the conclusion I reached after a staring contest with my seafood salad. The food was, to be generous, present. I had bravely ordered a dish that turned out to be slimier than a politician's promise, a wriggling heap of things I couldn't identify and didn't want to. I managed one bite before surrendering. The pork belly, thankfully, was more than present. It was excellent and plentiful. So plentiful, in fact, that I conveniently ignored the ancient Okinawan custom of Hara Hachi bu. This is a Confucian teaching that advises you to eat only until you are 80% full, a practice credited with helping Okinawans live to be about 1,000. It's a noble goal for a society that historically got by on purple sweet potatoes and bitter melon. For a man who had just gazed into a gelatinous abyss, finishing 100% of that pork belly felt less like gluttony and more like a moral imperative. This island is famous as a blue zone, one of those rare places where people have been living long, healthy lives for centuries. It's not just the diet of Goya and tofu. They have ikigai, a sense of life's purpose, and moai, which are lifelong social circles that provide real support. It's a beautiful, holistic approach to existence, built on purpose, community, and not overdoing it at lunch. This all sounds wonderful. A blueprint for eternal life written in seaweed and social bonds, but then you drive around. You begin to notice that the golden arches of McDonald's are nearly as common as the guardian Shisas. You have to wonder if the steady discipline of Hara Hachi bu can hold up against the siren song of a Big Mac. The cultural whiplash didn't stop there. We watched a traditional dance performance that, for one baffling segment, included a full-on breakdancing routine. Later we learned that certain vending machines will sell you frozen clothes, a clever solution to a problem I'm not convinced has ever existed. The whole thing creates a paradox. This is an island celebrated for its profound and time-tested wisdom on how to live well. Yet it's also a place where the local Lawson convenience store will happily sell you a slab of fried spam on a stick, an offer I found myself politely declining in my mind as I walked out into the humid air. Empty hand, the philosophical pivot of a powerful practice. My stomach was still trying to negotiate a peace treaty with that seafood salad, as I pondered modern Okinawa, an island where tradition seems to be in a constant and slightly weird dance-off with the present. 1 minute you're learning about a diet that permits you to 110 years old, the next you're being offered fried spam from a convenience store. It's a place where ancient folk dances can suddenly feature breakdancing, which prepares you for the fact that Okinawa's most famous export, karate, isn't exactly what you think it is. For starters, it's not really Japanese. It was born here in the Ryukyu Kingdom, a bustling trade hub that for centuries was its own country. The local self-defense style, called ti or hand, got blended with a variety of Chinese fighting arts, or kenpo. The finished product was a practical, no-nonsense way to handle trouble. This evolution went into overdrive when the Japanese Satsuma clan invaded in the 1600s and issued a rather short-sighted decree banning all weapons. This is like telling a room full of engineers they can't use wrenches and being shocked when they invent a robot that can disassemble a car with its bare fingers. The Okinawans simply perfected a way to be the weapon. For most of its life, the ART was called karate, but the first character meant China. It was an honest name, China Hand, a nod to its roots. But when a master named Gichin Funakoshi decided to introduce the art to mainland Japan in the early 20th century, he realized the name had a public relations problem. Selling China Hand to a fiercely nationalistic Japan was like trying to sell sand at the beach. So he made a change that was nothing short of marketing genius. He swapped the character for China with another one, also pronounced Kara, that meant empty. I can just picture the brainstorming session. Okay, team, China Hand is polling poorly. We need something that sounds the same but feels more domestic and philosophical. Something that says we don't need weapons, but also we are profoundly and uniquely Japanese. How about empty hand? It was perfect. Not only did it describe a weaponless art, but it neatly scrubbed the foreign connection and wrapped the whole thing in a cloak of Zen respectability. Funakoshi, now called the father of modern karate, insisted its purpose was perfecting character, not starting fights. He even coined a maxim, karate ni sente nashi, or there is no first attack in karate. Of course, to make sure you never have to attack first, you have to get very, very good at attacking second, and with gusto. This training generally involves 3 rituals. Kihon, the endless repetition of punches and kicks at an invisible enemy, Keita, a sort of violent solo dance routine that acts as a library of painful techniques, and kumite, where you finally get to see if all that punching the air works on a person. They call it Empty Hand, a name born from a clever marketing choice, but the art itself was born from full-throated necessity, a creation of people who were attacked first. Foremost flavors, forged in the fusion of force and food. Just as Gichin Funakoshi had ingeniously rebranded Okinawan self-defense from the foreign China Hand to the philosophical Empty Hand, we left the world of disciplined kicks and found ourselves staring at its polar opposite, the extremely full hand of American-style consumerism. We ventured to the American Village, a sprawling complex conveniently located just outside a U.S. Air Force base, which immediately sparked a chat with my son about America's global footprint. It's not every day you see the nation's twin pillars of influence, military might and pop culture, standing side by side like a buddy cop movie waiting to happen. The village itself is a curious spectacle. It's as if someone took that internet meme, "Be the American that Japanese anime thinks you are," and made it a business plan. The place is a riot of bright colors, questionable architecture, and a giant Ferris wheel, all seemingly designed by someone whose only reference for America was a bootleg DVD of Grease 2. It's an idealized, almost hallucinatory version of the States, a cultural copy that's somehow cleaner and more enthusiastic than the original. To fully commit to the experience, we indulged in some Blue Seal ice cream, an Okinawan icon whose slogan is "Born in America, raised in Okinawa." So how does an American ice cream get raised in Okinawa? Apparently, it gets a special education. The stuff was born as Foremost ice cream back in 1948, exclusively for GIS on the military bases. When it finally moved off base in the 60s, the recipe was changed. They say it was reformulated to withstand the tropical heat, which resulted in a texture that's a little less creamy and a little more chewy. It's ice cream engineered for survival, a frozen dessert with grit. This culinary remix wasn't a one-off. It's the island's signature move. You see it in taco rice, a dish invented by a local man who correctly deduced that American soldiers would eat anything if it was covered in taco seasoning and served over rice. You see it in the surprising celebrity status of Spam, a leftover from post-war military rations that worked its way into everything from the local stir-fry, Goya-chan puru, to a gas station breakfast staple, pork tamago onigiri. And you see it in the A-lunch specials, gut-busting platters of fried chicken and hamburger steak designed to satisfy an American-sized appetite. You can't escape it. One night, we stood before an energetically stocked Lawson convenience store, its fluorescent lights illuminating a wall of plastic-wrapped, single-serving fried Spam. Across the street, an A&W root beer drive-in glowed, its sign proudly advertising American food to the Okinawans. Here was the sweet, salty echo of history. Here was the strange taste of a decades-long cultural exchange. Here was dinner. Maida's Medic, a monument to mercy. Our deep dive into America's Okinawan footprint continued from the neon and denim fantasy of American Village to a place of far grimmer historical weight. A short drive took us to Desmond Doss Point, a spot where we were immediately adopted by another member of Okinawa's unofficial welcoming committee of enthusiastic seniors. He was a kindly gentleman, eager to practice his conversational English, a language he wielded with the cheerful precision of a gardener using a flamethrower. These local experts seem to be a fixture here, retirees who have repurposed their golden years into becoming impromptu historians on the very ground where history happened. He gave us the short version, which is good because the long version would probably involve a feature-length film, which, as it turns out, it already did. The man of the hour is Corporal Desmond Doss, and the place is the Maida Escarpment, better known by its grisly wartime nickname, Hacksaw Ridge. Doss was a U.S. Army medic and a Seventh-day Adventist, a combination that led him to the rather inconvenient conviction that while he was happy to serve, he would not be carrying a weapon. He showed up to the deadliest battle of the Pacific armed with little more than a Bible and a first aid kit, a decision that went over splendidly with his superiors. What he did here feels less like military history and more like a story from mythology. While American forces threw themselves against this heavily fortified Japanese stronghold, Doss, the man without a gun, repeatedly ran into the fire to drag wounded soldiers back. This wasn't a simple piggyback ride to safety. He single-handedly lowered an estimated 75 men one by one down this 400-foot sheer cliff face. It was like watching David fight Goliath. If David had decided to fight by patching up all the other Israelites Goliath had already knocked down. For his efforts, President Truman gave him the Medal of Honor, making him the first conscientious objector ever to receive it. He had stared down a war and won his argument. Today, the site is a park. The jungle has 80 years of regrowth on it, a quiet green blanket thrown over old wounds. Walking trails wind through what was once a kill zone, and a monument stands with a description of Doss's actions in both Japanese and English. You can still see a geological feature called the Needle Rock jutting out defiantly. But the most powerful feature is the escarpment itself. Even with all the trees, you can lean over the railing and appreciate the staggering steepness of the drop. It's one thing to hear the number 400 feet. It's another thing entirely to see it. It's a long way down, especially when you're carrying a friend. The typhoon of steel that ended an empire. Standing on the quiet ground of Hacksaw Ridge, hearing about one man's bravery feels like a complete story. You get the hero, the impossible odds, the Medal of Honor. It's neat. You might think, well, that about covers it, and head off in search of some of that famous Okinawan blue seal ice cream. But the story of Desmond Doss is like learning about the single loudest scream in a stadium-sized riot. It was a part of the Battle of Okinawa, but the battle itself was a different beast entirely. It was the last, biggest and deadliest party of the Pacific War, an 82-day festival of explosives the Allies quaintly named Operation Iceberg, presumably because Operation Unimaginable Hellscape was already taken. The Okinawans had a better name for it, the Typhoon of Steel. Now, if you're planning a large-scale invasion of an island, conventional military wisdom suggests you should probably fight the enemy on the beach. The Japanese general, Mitsuru Ushijima, decided to buck convention. Instead of meeting the American 10th Army at the water's edge, he essentially held the door open for them, waved them ashore, and waited. His plan was devious and, frankly, strategically insane. He had no intention of winning. The goal was to make the process of taking Okinawa so gruesome, so costly in American blood, that the Allies would look at the price tag for invading mainland Japan and opt for a negotiated peace instead. It was less a military strategy and more a national murder-suicide pact. The Americans were drawn south into a maze of fortified hills and caves centered on the ancient Shuri castle. What followed was a slow, brutal slog. US Marines had to clear out Japanese soldiers from this rocky honeycomb, one cave at a time, often with flamethrowers. Meanwhile, out on the water, the Navy was on the receiving end of the most concentrated kamikaze attacks of the war. Thousands of pilots on one-way trips turned the sky into a shooting gallery where the gallery shot back. In a final grand gesture of futility, the Imperial Navy sent its prize battleship, the Yamato, steaming toward the island with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. It never made it. US planes sunk it long before it could fire a shot, like a heavyweight boxer getting tripped on his way to the ring. The deepest horror, however, wasn't for the men in uniform, it was for the Okinawan people, who were caught between these two grinding machines. An estimated third of the civilian population died. The Japanese army stole their food, used them as shields, and fed them a diet of propaganda about the monstrous Americans. This led to one of history's most ghastly chapters. Japanese soldiers, convinced that surrender was worse than death, gave grenades to families and ordered them to commit suicide. In the caves and along the cliffs, entire communities chose oblivion over capture. The Americans won, but the victory felt more like a receipt for a purchase you deeply regret. Over 50,000 Allied casualties. The sheer fanaticism of the Japanese defense gave President Truman a chilling preview of what an invasion of the home islands would look like. It presented him with a new and awful kind of arithmetic. The question was no longer just about winning, but about how to make the killing stop. How many were projected to die in an invasion versus how many would die from a single terrible new weapon? How do you even begin to do that math? Forced fate, the fractured memory of Okinawa's fall. "What happened to the regular people?" my son asked, breaking the silence as we drove away from the cliffs. We'd just spent an hour at a memorial park where the Typhoon of steel had reached its brutal end. Were they just stuck in the middle? "It's more complicated than that," I said. "They weren't just stuck. In many cases, they were pushed." The story of the Okinawan civilians is one of those historical rabbit holes where the deeper you go, the less sense it makes. It starts with a concept that sounds almost heroic if you don't examine it too closely. Gyokusai, or shattering jewels. This was the Japan military's official marketing slogan for death before dishonor, a philosophy that surrender was the ultimate shame and one should fight to the last man. The problem was, they extended this brand loyalty program to the civilians. Propaganda posters and stern-faced officials warned the Okinawans that the approaching Americans were beasts, devils who would commit unspeakable horrors. In a moment of truly breathtaking projection, Japan's soldiers would sometimes tell civilians that the Americans would do to them the very things the Imperial Army had become famous for doing elsewhere. It was a bit like a fox warning the chickens about a particularly savage hamster. The message, a quick self-inflicted death, was far better than capture. This is where the story turns from a tragedy of war into something far more sinister. It wasn't just a suggestion. According to countless survivor accounts, Japan soldiers began passing out hand grenades to families huddled in caves, sometimes with a cheerful demonstration on how to use them. This wasn't a grassroots movement, it was a top-down directive for self-annihilation, an official policy of compulsory group suicide, or shudan jiketsu. It's a term so clinically chilling it sounds like it was invented by a committee that writes instruction manuals for office equipment. Inside my own head, I tried to make it make sense. You're a soldier. Your duty is to protect civilians. But your other duty, the one drilled into you by the emperor-worshipping state, is to ensure no one provides intelligence to the enemy. And since Okinawans were often seen as second-class subjects anyway, the GRIM calculus becomes clear. Their safety was less important than their silence. In the dark, crowded caves, soldiers ordered families to kill themselves. If a baby's cry threatened to give away a position, the solution was not to move, but to eliminate the source of the sound. You would think a horror of this scale would be a settled matter. You would be spectacularly wrong. In 2007, Japan's Ministry of Education suggested that textbook publishers might want to soften the language around this whole affair. Perhaps ordered to commit suicide was too strong. Maybe something like were driven into or the military was involved in mass suicides would be better. It's the sort of semantic hair-splitting you'd expect from an insurance adjuster trying to classify a hurricane as a significant wind event. Okinawa responded with the largest protest in its history. Over 100,000 people took to the streets, furious that their agony was being reduced to a grammatical debate. Their message was simple. The euphemisms could not erase the memories or the scars. The fight had been won years earlier in a way by the novelist Kenzaburo Oe. He wrote about the military's role and was promptly sued for defamation by two former officers who insisted they'd never given such orders. Oe won. The courts affirmed the military's deep involvement, a rare legal victory for historical truth. You can still see the physical evidence. At the former Japan Navy Underground headquarters, a sprawling, damp command center carved into the rock, the walls are still pockmarked with shrapnel from where the commanding admiral and his staff shattered their jewels with grenades. The air is thick and cool, heavy with the weight of what happened in these tunnels. It's a permanent, uneditable record written in concrete and steel. The main island of Japan and Okinawa still don't quite agree on this chapter of their shared history. One side sees a tragic, voluntary act of loyalty, the other remembers coercion and betrayal. It leaves you wondering what happens when a nation can't decide on the narrative of its own past. Who gets to write the final draft? Dark Depths, a doomed departure. After learning that Japanese soldiers handed grenades to Okinawan families for mandatory self-destruction, you might assume you've reached the absolute bottom floor of wartime horror. You would be mistaken. It turns out there's a sub-basement, accessible only through a special kind of bureaucratic logic that designs a fire escape leading directly back into the fire. As American forces closed into the government in Tokyo, apparently fresh out of grenades, decided on a new strategy for protecting Okinawan civilians, putting them on a boat. The plan was a model of simplicity. Take thousands of evacuees, a great many of them schoolchildren, and ship them from Okinawa to the mainland. The vessel for this particular mission was the Tsushima Maru. On August 21, 1944, it steamed out of Naha harbor, packed with people fleeing a war. To ensure their safe passage through a sea teeming with enemy submarines, the ship sailed at night, completely unlighted and without any markings to indicate it was a civilian vessel. It was the maritime equivalent of trying to sneak across a freeway by dressing in black and crawling. In Naha today, the Tsushima Maru Memorial Hall stands as a quiet, gut-wrenching receipt for this policy. Inside, the story is told not with grand pronouncements but with small, devastating details. You see walls of school portraits, row after row of children aged 6 to 14, looking out with the unbothered expressions of kids who think their biggest problem is long division. They were asleep in the holds when the torpedoes from the American submarine USS Bowfin struck. The memorial's mission statement says its purpose is to tell the next generation how precious life and peace is and how tragic and foolish war is. Foolish seems too gentle a word for it. Of the nearly 1,800 people on board, about 1,500 died, including almost 800 of the children in those photographs. What followed was a masterclass in institutional panic. Fearing more torpedoes, the convoy's escort ships didn't stop to rescue survivors immediately. Back in Tokyo, the government, deeply concerned with public morale, imposed a strict gag order on the entire incident. The official strategy was to pretend it never happened. For decades, the families of the dead and the handful of child survivors were forbidden to speak of it, leaving the single greatest tragedy in Japan's wartime sea lanes to fester in silence. This commitment to burying uncomfortable truths was becoming a pattern. Of course, you might say the American submarine crew was just doing its job, targeting what appeared to be a legitimate enemy transport in a convoy. You would be right. War is not a business of checking identification. The USS Bowfin Submarine Museum at Pearl Harbor even acknowledges the sinking, a footnote of profound regret. But it highlights the fundamental horror of the situation. One group of men was doing its duty by sinking ships, while another group was doing its duty by putting children on those exact ships for their safety. The whole affair was a calamitous, lethal failure of common sense, a tragedy born from the collision of military pragmatism and a government's cynical desperation. And for years the ones who paid the price were silenced, their story just another ghost haunting the waters south of Japan. The last gasp of the world's mightiest battleship. All is vanity, says the preacher, and a striving after wind. Leaving the quiet hall dedicated to the schoolchildren of the Tsushima Maru, you think you've reached the bottom of wartime tragedy. You feel a specific kind of stillness, the kind that comes from confronting a loss so pointless it defies argument. Then you turn a corner and learn that the architects of that desperation had one last, fantastically loud, and even more pointless idea up their sleeves. It was called the super battleship Yamato. In the world of things that are needlessly, almost comically large, the Yamato was king. At 72,000 tons, it was less a ship and more a floating piece of the Earth's crust that someone had strapped guns to. And what guns? Its main cannons were so enormous they could throw an object the size and weight of a family sedan over the horizon. The entire project was the ultimate expression of the big gun school of thought, a philosophy that would soon prove as relevant as phrenology. For most of the war, the Yamato and her sister ship, the Musashi, were the Imperial Navy's finest china, too precious to actually use in a fight for fear they might get scratched. The Japanese High Command held them back, knowing the age of the aircraft carrier had arrived, leaving their greatest assets to sit in port like the world's most menacing lawn ornaments. By April 1945, however, the house was on fire, and the theoretical value of the china no longer mattered. With American forces landing on Okinawa, the High Command decided it was time for a grand gesture. Their thinking, twisted like a pretzel from years of strategic decline, produced Operation 10 Go. This was a plan so gloriously doomed it bordered on performance art. The Yamato, with just enough fuel for a one-way trip and almost no friendly planes for protection, would sail to Okinawa. There, it would intentionally run itself aground and become a permanent, unsinkable gun platform. It was a strategy with the same tactical brilliance as a man nailing his feet to the floor to win a fistfight. The end, when it came, was not the glorious duel the ship was built for. It wasn't a battle of titans trading blows across the ocean. On April 7, 1945, American scout planes found the Yamato. The ship designed to crush other battleships was swarmed by nearly 400 small, buzzing aircraft. It was like watching a heavyweight champion trained for a single epic bout get pecked to death by a cloud of angry hornets. For 3 hours, dive bombers and torpedo planes did their work. After absorbing 11 torpedoes and at least 6 bombs, the beast finally gave up. It rolled over, and a fire in one of its main ammunition magazines touched off an explosion so colossal it ripped the ship in half and sent a mushroom cloud blooming thousands of feet into the air. Over 3,000 men went down with it. The sinking wasn't just a naval loss. It was the final violent proof that an entire way of thinking about war was dead. The age of the big gun was over, and the empty sky now owned the sea. How a sunken battleship became a star-faring savior. The final mission of the battleship Yamato was not what you would call a career highlight. Ending up as a heap of exploded metal at the bottom of the ocean rarely is. You'd think the story would end there, a grim monument to misplaced faith in big guns and a rather definitive full stop on the Imperial Japanese Navy. And for a long time, it did. The official story, preserved in museums like the one in Kura, is a somber tale of technological marvel and human tragedy. It is the historical equivalent of a lecture on why you should not bring a knife, even a very, very large one, to a gunfight held 1,000 feet in the air. But in Japan, a country that has perfected the art of turning almost anything into a cartoon, the Yamato got a second act. For generations that grew up after the war, the name Yamato doesn't evoke a failed suicide mission. It evokes a spaceship. This is thanks to a 1974 anime series, Space Battleship Yamato, which performed one of the most audacious acts of cultural recycling in history. The plot is simple, in the way that building a time-traveling DeLorean is simple. Earth is a radioactive wasteland thanks to alien bombs, and humanity's only hope is a device from a friendly alien planet. To get there, they need a ship. So they secretly drag the rusted-out skeleton of the Yamato from the sea floor and, with what I can only assume was a galactic quantity of WD-40 and some very optimistic engineers, rebuild it into a star-cruising battleship. This was a stroke of absolute genius. It was a national rebranding campaign that would make a Madison Avenue executive weep with envy. In one clean motion, the Yamato was laundered. It was no longer a symbol of a disastrous imperial war, but the literal savior of the human race. Its mission was no longer a futile act of conquest, but a desperate, noble quest for survival. The crew was not a group of men sent to die for an emperor, but a collection of bright-eyed young people sacrificing themselves for their home world. This stunning narrative shift allowed the name Yamato, which is also an old poetic term for Japan itself, to be passed on. It was a way to keep the powerful name, but scrape off all the unpleasantness of its actual history. The ship's purpose was inverted, its shame was erased, and its destiny was rewritten from a catastrophic failure into a heroic rebirth. Crimson Creation, rebuilding Ryukyu from ruin. A fall into a ditch makes you wiser, Japanese proverb. The Japanese have a real knack for resurrecting their national symbols. Having learned how they dredged the battleship Yamato from the seafloor and rebooted it into a heroic cartoon spaceship, it was hardly a shock to find Okinawa attempting a similar trick. Here, the subject is Shuri Castle, a landmark that seems to have more lives than a comic book hero trapped in a cycle of cancellations and gritty revivals. The original castle was the heart of the Ryukyu kingdom for 450 years, a good run that ended when Japan annexed the islands in 1879. Then, during the Battle of Okinawa, American bombs reduced it to a scenic pile of kindling. It was carefully put back together by 1992, a stunning vermilion palace, only to burn to the ground again in a spectacular 2019 fire. The current plan is to have it ready for visitors by 2026. This isn't a castle, it's a subscription service for national tragedy. The fire that took the castle was a profound blow to the people of Okinawa, for whom it was the primary symbol of their distinct culture. After everyone sifted through the ashes, the final report ruled out arson and settled on a far more mundane villain, an electrical fault. All that history, all that vermilion lacquer, undone by what amounted to bad wiring. The investigation noted that the castle's fire prevention systems were a bit dated, which is a polite way of saying they couldn't detect a raging inferno until it was fully raging. Standing on the grounds today, what hits you is not the majesty of a finished palace, but the organized chaos of its rebirth. Cranes slice the air where ornate rooftops ought to be. The whole place smells of fresh-cut lumber and sheer stubbornness. You can walk through the surviving stone gates and find yourself in a vast courtyard, staring at a ghost. The main hall, the Sidon, is just gone, leaving an empty plaza that feels like a missing front tooth in a proud smile. You are touring a UNESCO World Heritage construction site. The decision to visit a building that isn't there feels odd. But the Okinawans have turned the agonizingly slow process of rebuilding into the main exhibit. You can peer through viewing windows to watch artisans shape giant cypress logs with frightening precision. They are putting their spirit of resilience, their chimugukuru, on public display. It is a powerful statement. One detail they're faithfully restoring is that the main hall faces west. It was a clear nod to the kingdom's biggest trading partner, China, and a silent 450-year-long snub to mainland Japan, which sat uncomfortably off to the east. While teams of workers piece the new palace together, another group is engaged in a quieter restoration nearby. An association is working to revive the area's butterfly populations. It seems a fitting parallel. One group raises a fortress from the ashes, and another releases tiny winged jewels into the air. One hopes they are keeping the butterflies a safe distance from any new electrical panels. Labyrinth of Last Resort, the Navy's underground bastion in Okinawa. After spending a day contemplating Okinawan structures that seem to rise from the ashes more often than a comic book superhero, my ambition turned to a place that was decidedly permanent: the former Japanese Navy underground headquarters. "We missed it," my son said, looking at his phone. "By 2 minutes." He was right. The sign was unyielding. Last entry, 4:30 p.m. Current time, 4:32 p.m. I had a vision of a man inside looking at a finely calibrated atomic clock before slamming a heavy vault door shut. Mission accomplished. We peeked through a small window. Down a concrete ramp, a large group of Japanese schoolchildren, ridiculously punctual even on a Sunday, was getting a lecture. Denied entry, I was forced to resort to the second best source of information: the large, very informative sign. I learned that this subterranean command center was dug by hand. Men with pickaxes and shovels carved out 450 meters of tunnels to run a war while the world was ending above them. They crammed 4,000 naval personnel into these dim, stuffy corridors. The place was a grim human beehive, built to direct a naval battle from deep within the hills of Tomigu-suku. The paradox of the place is its most famous story. As American forces were about to overrun the position, Rear Admiral Minoru Ota knew the end was near. But instead of a final defiant banzai, he sent a remarkably humane telegram to Tokyo. He didn't write about glory or empire. He wrote about the Okinawan civilians, praising their immense sacrifice and begging the government to give them special consideration after the war was over. It's a stunning piece of compassion from inside a hopeless situation. Shortly after sending it, he and his staff took their own lives with hand grenades. The sign noted that the walls of the command room still bear the shrapnel scars. A stark, physical record of that final, violent act. This is what I came to see. I find that sort of thing interesting, a permanent reminder of a final decision. Now, you might argue that with a 5 p.m. closing time, our 4:32 p.m. arrival left nearly 30 minutes, which is exactly the officially recommended viewing time. We technically had a window. But rules are rules, especially when they are posted on a sign next to a locked door. Faced with the formidable presence of a school tour and the specter of administrative disapproval, we did the only sensible thing. We made a strategic cultural retreat. Sacred Slice. The Samurai's Solemn Sacrifice. My attempt to see the former Japanese Navy underground headquarters had ended, fittingly, in failure. Arriving 2 minutes after the last entry, I was left to ponder my own minor dishonor while a class of schoolchildren got a lesson on the Major League version inside, where an admiral and his staff once chose grenades over surrender. Now, you might think this a ghoulish topic to fixate on after a scheduling mix-up, but in Japan, the art of the honorable exit was once a highly refined practice. My failure to check a website hardly compares to losing a battle for your shogun, but it did get me thinking about how seriously some cultures take the concept of atonement. For the samurai, the answer wasn't a stiff drink and a vow to do better tomorrow. It was a knife. Seppuku was the ultimate career ender. At its core, it was a feature, not a bug, of Bushido, the samurai code that placed honor so far above life that the two weren't even in the same league. It was a way to apologize for a catastrophic mistake, avoid the shame of capture, or even loyally follow your lord into the great beyond. The whole thing was an elaborate affair, sort of a going-away party where you were the guest of honor and also the main course. You'd dress in white, which seems like a poor sartorial choice given the coming mess, maybe write a quick death poem about the fleeting nature of existence, and then get down to business. The business involved a short blade, the tanto, and a deep personal introduction to your own abdomen. The idea was to slice from left to right, then up, a move requiring a level of conviction most of us can't muster to get out of bed on a Monday. Because this was excruciating and not always immediately effective, you were allowed to bring a friend. This assistant, the kaishakunin, stood behind you with a long sword, ready to perform a merciful decapitation the moment you made your move. He was the designated driver of ritual suicide, there to make sure things ended cleanly and you didn't survive your own disembowelment, which I imagine was considered the height of bad form. This wasn't just a way for warriors to opt out. It became the official form of capital punishment for samurai who'd broken the law, a system that allowed them to die with their dignity intact rather than at the hands of a common executioner. And for those who were perhaps a bit squeamish, they eventually streamlined the process with something called sensubara, or fan seppuku. In this highly efficient version, the condemned would simply reach for a fan placed on the tray where the knife should have been. The moment his hand touched it, the kaishakunin would strike. It was all the ritual, all the honor, and none of the agonizing self-surgery. It was the Cliff's Notes version of dying with integrity. This wasn't just a theoretical practice. The floorboards of Fushimi Castle, soaked with the blood of Tori Mototada and his men after they committed seppuku to delay an enemy army in 1600, were repurposed as ceilings in several Kyoto temples. You can visit today and look up at the dark, rust-colored stains of a 400-year-old sacrifice soaked right into the grain. The practice was finally banned in 1873, but it has a way of rearing its head, most famously when author Yukio Mishima tried it in 1970 after a failed coup. Still, it belonged almost exclusively to the samurai. A farmer who had a bad harvest wasn't expected to follow suit. This was a privilege reserved for the warrior class. Standing outside the closed gates of the naval headquarters, I felt a strange connection to that lost world of ceremony and consequence. The shrapnel marks on the walls inside were a modern, brutalist version of those blood-stained temple ceilings. My own consequence was less severe. I had to decide what to do with the rest of our afternoon. Stark stanzas, the samurai's serene farewell. Learning about the formal mechanics of seppuku was not an altogether cheerful affair. Yet the business of honorably ending one's life in feudal Japan wasn't just about the blade. Before the main event, a samurai often engaged in a final, more contemplative act, composing a death poem. This was the jizei, a short final verse that served as a surprisingly calm sign-off to a life of discipline and presumably a lot of sword-related stress. This tradition grew from a deep bed of Zen Buddhist and Shinto beliefs, particularly the idea of mujo, or impermanence. The core concept is that life is a fleeting show, as brief and beautiful as a cherry blossom getting knocked off a branch by a stiff breeze. The poems themselves reflect this. They are stark, unsentimental, and lean heavily on nature imagery. A samurai wouldn't write about being scared. He'd compare his life to a cloud blocking the moon or a leaf giving up its grip on a tree. It's the ultimate expression of mastering fear by simply nodding at the inevitable. The decision to compose one was a deliberate choice to frame one's own ending. Consider the 15th century samurai Ota Dokan, who, upon being stabbed by an assassin, supposedly recited this classic of the genre. Had I not known that I was dead, already, I would have mourned, my loss of life. It's a Zen paradox so profound it circles back around to sounding like something a philosophy major would say after one too many drinks, yet it expresses a complete understanding that the self is an illusion, making the line between life and death seem rather trivial. Then you have the more modern and far more theatrical example of Yukio Mishima. In 1970, the controversial author committed seppuku in a shocking public act meant to fuse his art and his life. His jisei was pure dramatic poetry. A small night storm blows, saying falling is the essence of a flower, preceding those who hesitate. This wasn't just a poem, it was the closing line to a performance piece, a final, horrifying bit of personal branding that identified him with the samurai ideals he championed. The West has a tradition of remembering death, memento mori, but it has a completely different energy. Memento mori is the grim, clerical uncle at the family reunion, pulling you aside to warn that God is keeping receipts and you'd better act right. It's a moral admonition. Jisei is the quiet cousin who finds enlightenment in the pattern of raindrops on a pond, offers a single, placid observation, and then exits the stage. One is a warning about divine judgment. The other is a personal statement of internal peace. The formal practice has mostly vanished in Japan. Mishima's poem is often seen as the tradition's last great public gasp. Its spirit, however, arguably survives in a softer, more practical form known as ending notes. A samurai's jisei was a philosophical testament on the nature of existence. A modern ending note is more likely to be a personal farewell with instructions on where to find the passwords. One reaches for the universal, the other makes sure someone remembers to feed the cat. Commands curry, a complicated commercial legacy. Having meditated on the fine art of the death poem, on the calm acceptance of a life's end, and on the shocking finality of ritual suicide, our journey turned, as all profound spiritual journeys must, toward a shopping mall. I had heard rumors of a massive aquarium inside, and that seemed as good a reason as any to trade philosophy for commerce. We were headed home, but the siren song of a giant fish tank is a powerful one. On the way, I became fascinated by the local system for flagging questionable drivers. Here, novices announced themselves with a green and yellow feather emblem, a charmingly organic symbol for "I have no idea what I'm doing." This, however, was not the most interesting part. Apparently, the original symbol for elderly drivers was a teardrop, meant to represent a falling autumn leaf. Someone eventually pointed out that this was perhaps not the most encouraging metaphor for one's golden years. The government, in a spectacular feat of problem-solving by perkiness, replaced it with a cheerful four-leaf clover. Death metaphor out. Garden variety luck in. This deep thought on automotive hieroglyphics carried me all the way to the Aeon Mall, Okinawa Ryukyu. Its name alone is a historical artifact. Ryukyu is a phantom limb of the post-war American occupation, a linguistic echo of the Ryukyu command headquarters that once controlled this area. The mall itself stands on what used to be the Aways Meadows golf course, a patch of recreational turf for U.S. military personnel. The transition from a military fairway to a retail paradise felt strangely appropriate, a new kind of American cultural invasion replacing the old one. We even spotted a fair number of our countrymen wandering the halls, drawn from the nearby Marine base like moths to a fluorescent air-conditioned flame. Attached to the mall was a small reconstructed Okinawan village, which, to be frank, had all the authentic energy of a theme park ride. But my son had not come for history lessons, nor for underwhelming cultural exhibits. His purpose was singular, his quest unwavering. He was here for curry. His dedication to Japanese curry throughout our trip was a thing of beauty. And so, we found ourselves in a food court, where he once again ordered a steaming plate of it. Watching him eat, I marveled at how this particular dish ever became a Japanese staple. It turns out curry is not just food. It is a historical cure. It arrived in Japan not from India, but from Britain during the Meiji Restoration. The Imperial Japanese Navy adopted the thick, stew-like dish for a brilliant and entirely practical reason: to fight beriberi. Their sailors, living mostly on polished white rice, were suffering from a severe vitamin deficiency. A savvy naval medical officer, Takaki Kanehiro, noticed that Western sailors with more varied diets were perfectly healthy. The solution was simple. Trick Japanese sailors into eating meat and vegetables by hiding them in a delicious brown sauce. It was a public health initiative disguised as lunch. The tradition is so strong that the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force still serves curry every Friday, a culinary ritual born from nutritional desperation. As my son scraped his plate clean, his personal mission accomplished, I thought about how a nation had taken a foreign dish, introduced to solve a medical crisis, and transformed it into a beloved comfort food. In his book, Modern Japanese Cuisine, Katazina Kwertka notes the Navy's logic with clinical precision. The convenience of curry rice as a meal that combined a staple with a side dish in a single bowl rendered it attractive from the point of view of military catering. Sailor's sickness, the imperial cure in a curry bowl. That curry my son devoured at the mall was not just a meal. It was a historical document served in a bowl. It was a public health initiative simmered in gravy. It was his unknowing participation in a century-old dietary correction that saved the Japanese Navy from itself. The story begins, as so many tragedies do, with a desire to be fancy. In the 19th century, Japan's urban elite, particularly the samurai of Edo, developed a taste for polished white rice. It was the designer handbag of carbohydrates, a status symbol that announced you were several tax brackets above the commoner munching on pedestrian brown rice. The problem is that milling rice strips away the bran, which also happens to contain all the thiamine. This resulted in beriberi, a nasty vitamin B1 deficiency that became so common in the capital it was nicknamed the Edo affliction. It was a disease of aspiration. Now, you might argue that a story about nutritional deficiencies sounds about as thrilling as watching paint dry. But this was a matter of national security. As Japan rapidly modernized, its new imperial navy adopted the preferred food of the upper class. Soon, entire crews were getting sick. On one training voyage, nearly half the sailors came down with beriberi, and dozens died. A nation cannot project power when its sailors are too weak to hoist a sail, much less fire a cannon. The Japanese Navy was being crippled by a food trend. Enter Takaki Kanehiro, a naval doctor who had studied in Britain. He noticed a curious thing. British sailors, who subsisted on a varied diet of meat, bread, and vegetables, did not suffer from this mysterious illness. He hypothesized, incorrectly as it turned out, that the cause was a protein deficiency, but being wrong about the why didn't stop him from being right about the what. He convinced the Navy to let him run an experiment. He sent one ship, the Tsukuba, on a long voyage with a new menu heavy on barley, meat, milk, and vegetables. The results were stunning. Beriberi cases plummeted to almost zero. This is where curry enters the picture. The Navy needed a way to cram these life-saving nutrients into sailors efficiently. The British, who had picked up a taste for a thick, stew-like version of curry in India, had already introduced it to Japan. It was perfect. You could throw meat and vegetables into a huge pot, cook it into a savory stew, and serve it over rice. It was nutritious, easy to make in bulk, and sailors actually liked it. It was the delicious cure to the disease of good taste. The tradition stuck. To this day, every Friday is Curry Day in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, each vessel boasting its own unique recipe, a weekly tribute to the stew that conquered a vitamin deficiency. With that culinary history absorbed, our own mission continued. A quick dive into Toys R Us confirmed we had not won the Nintendo Switch lottery. We then hit a Lawson convenience store filled with Americans. We grabbed some breakfast items. My son and I had an aquatic-themed day planned for tomorrow, a fishing trip, followed by an aquarium. It was not an entirely uneventful evening, and so we close Chapter 8. The past is another country's castle. having seen how modern Okinawa's character is built from the layered history of its indigenous, Japanese, and American influences. Next time, the journey north reveals the deep foundations of the island's geology, its marine life, and even its fast food. Until then, thanks for listening to The Rise the Limit. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Shinkansen, and Sensibility. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon.